Midnight in Black and White, the relaxing history of film noir. There's something about a city at night that invites reflection. Streetlights hum softly above empty sidewalks. Rain turns pavement into a shifting mirror. In an upstairs window, a single lamp glows long after the rest of the building has gone dark. It was in this atmosphere, quiet, uncertain, and gently shadowed, that film noir first took shape. Emerging in 1940s Hollywood through films like The Maltese Falcon and Double Indemnity, noir gave cinematic form to a world still recovering from economic hardship and global war. Its stories were not loud, but intimate. Its heroes were not flawless, but thoughtful. Its streets were less chaotic than contemplative, places where choices carried weight and silence spoke volumes. Yet noir did not simply belong to one decade. Shaped by hard-boiled writers such as Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler, and visually influenced by European filmmakers like Fritz Lang, it became more than a genre. It became a mood, a way of seeing the world in light and shadow. Even as the classic era faded, its influence endured, reappearing in later films like Chinatown and Blade Runner. The history of noir, then, is not just the story of style, but of an atmosphere, one that continues to flicker softly wherever uncertainty and longing meet beneath the glow of a street lamp. Part 1. Shadows Before the Storm. The world that created noir. Before there were private eyes in rumpled trench coats, before cigarette smoke curled through the light of a lonely desk lamp, before a woman's voice drifted across a room like a half-remembered melody, there was a quieter story unfolding. A story about cities growing taller, nights growing longer, and ordinary people learning how to live with uncertainty. To understand film noir, it helps to begin not in a dark alley, but in the soft glow of an apartment window sometime in the early 1930s. Imagine a city after midnight. The streetcars have slowed. A few taxis drift past like silent boats. Somewhere, a radio plays low enough not to disturb the neighbors. A crooner's voice, warm and distant, floating through thin walls. America, at this time, was still recovering from a shock of the Great Depression. The crash of 1929 had not only emptied bank accounts, it had unsettled something deeper. Faith in progress, in prosperity, in the idea that tomorrow would naturally be better than today. All of that had grown fragile. Millions of people had lost jobs, homes, or savings. Breadlines and shuttered storefronts became part of the landscape, as familiar as street lamps and sidewalks. Yet life did not stop. People adapted. They moved into smaller apartments. They shared meals. They learned to stretch coffee, to mend clothes, to take comfort in small routines. Cities, especially, became places of anonymity, where one person's hardship blended quietly into the larger crowd. You could disappear in a city, not by running away, but simply by being one face among thousands. At night, the city felt different, less hurried, more reflective. Office buildings stood dark and silent, their daytime purpose suspended. Neon signs hummed softly over diners and corner bars that never quite closed. Rain, when it came, turned streets into mirrors, doubling the lights and blurring the edges of everything. This atmosphere, subdued, introspective, a little lonely, would later become the emotional landscape of film noir. Long before Hollywood gave it a name, the mood was already present in the popular stories people read. In drugstores and train stations, racks of pulp magazines offered cheap entertainment printed on rough paper. Their covers were bold and colorful, but inside were tales that often felt far quieter than their illustrations suggested. Writers like Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler created detectives who were not shining heroes, but tired professionals navigating a complicated world. Their characters walked the same city streets as everyone else. They rented modest offices. They worried about rent. They drank too much coffee and sometimes too much whiskey. They did not expect justice to be perfect. They settled, instead, for what could be done. In Hammett's stories, the city feels solid and unromantic, a place of business rather than adventure. His famous detective, Sam Spade, moves through San Francisco with a kind of practical calm, as if danger were simply another occupational hazard. Chandler's Philip Marlowe, by contrast, observes the world with a poetic weariness, noticing small details, the way light falls across a room, the sound of footsteps in a hallway, the peculiar loneliness of expensive furniture. These detectives were not invincible. They could be fooled, injured, even morally uncertain. What mattered was persistence, the quiet determination to keep going, to keep asking questions, to keep moving through the night until morning arrived. Readers found something reassuring in that persistence. During uncertain times, stories where someone simply continued forward, without grand speeches, without guarantees, felt honest. Meanwhile, Hollywood was telling its own nighttime stories. Early gangster films of the 1930s introduced audiences to characters who rose from poverty through ambition and nerve, only to fall again just as swiftly. Movies like Little Caesar and The Public Enemy showed cities as places of opportunity, but also of risk, environments where success and failure could hinge on a single decision made in a single moment. These films were energetic, even explosive at times, but beneath the action was a recognition that social structures had shifted. Traditional paths to stability, steady employment, predictable advancement had become unreliable. Characters improvised. They made choices without knowing whether those choices would lead upward or downward. As the decade progressed, audiences grew accustomed to stories where the line between hero and antihero was not entirely clear. Someone could be sympathetic and dangerous at the same time. Someone could do the wrong thing for understandable reasons. Someone could be trapped by circumstances rather than driven by villainy. All of this prepared viewers, quietly and gradually, for the moral ambiguity that would later define noir. Another change was taking place as well, one that had less to do with economics and more to do with geography. Cities were expanding rapidly. New apartment buildings rose along busy avenues. Elevated trains rattled overhead. Subways carried thousands of passengers through underground tunnels, where faces appeared and disappeared in a constant flow. In smaller towns, people tended to know one another. In big cities, it was possible to live for years without learning the names of the people next door. This anonymity created a peculiar kind of freedom, but also a subtle isolation. You could reinvent yourself, certainly, but you could also feel invisible. At night, that invisibility deepened. Windows glowed high above the street, each one containing a private world. Someone reading at a kitchen table, someone ironing a shirt for tomorrow, someone listening to a late broadcast while staring into space. From a sidewalk, those lives remained unknowable, just rectangles of light suspended in darkness. It is easy to imagine a future noir narrator gazing up at those windows, wondering who was awake, who was waiting, who was afraid, and who was simply passing time until sleep arrived. Technology, too, played its part in shaping the atmosphere. Radio had become the central hearth of modern life. Families gathered around it in the evening, listening to news, drama, comedy, and music transmitted invisibly through the air. Voices from hundreds or thousands of miles away entered living rooms as if they were speaking directly to each listener alone. Late-night radio, in particular, carried a distinctive mood. Programs slowed down. Announcers spoke more softly. Music drifted rather than marched. For people who could not sleep, shift workers, insomniacs, travelers in anonymous hotel rooms, the radio provided companionship without requiring conversation. That sense of disembodied presence, a voice in the darkness, would later become one of noir's most recognizable techniques. The intimate voiceover, confiding in the audience as if they were the only other person awake. Even architecture contributed to the feeling. Office buildings designed during the boom years now stood partially empty. Their clean lines and modern materials suggested optimism, but their dim corridors and echoing lobbies hinted at something more ambiguous. Elevators creaked upward through shafts of shadow. Marble floors reflected light in cold, wavering patterns. During the day, these spaces were efficient and purposeful. At night, they felt cavernous and uncertain, as if they belonged to a different world entirely. Through all of this, the American dream did not disappear. It simply grew more complicated. Success was still possible. Happiness was still imagined. But the path forward no longer seemed straight or guaranteed. It twisted. It detoured. It passed through neighborhoods where streetlights flickered and strangers kept their distance. People learned to live with that complexity. They went to work, paid bills, shared meals, fell in love, raised children. Yet beneath ordinary routines lingered a quiet awareness that stability could not be taken for granted. Fortune might change. Circumstances might shift. Plans might unravel. This awareness did not produce constant fear. More often, it produced a kind of subdued vigilance, a readiness to adapt, to endure, to carry on even when the future felt uncertain. And so, by the late 1930s, all the essential ingredients of film noir were already present, though no one had yet gathered them into a single cinematic form. The visual language of shadow and light was waiting. The literary voice of weary introspection was waiting. The social mood of cautious realism was waiting. All that remained was a catalyst, something that would intensify these elements, fuse them together, and give them a sharper edge. That catalyst would arrive soon enough, carried on ships and headlines and telegrams, reshaping not only nations but individual lives. It would darken the tone of storytelling, deepen the shadows, and introduce a new awareness of fragility. But for now, in this quieter pre-war moment, the night feels almost gentle. Imagine again that apartment window glowing above a nearly empty street. Inside, someone finishes a late cup of coffee and rinses the mug. Someone else folds a newspaper, smoothing its creases. A clock ticks steadily on a wall. Outside, a light breeze moves a scrap of paper along the curb. Nothing dramatic happens. No sirens. No footsteps running in the dark. Just a soft continuation of ordinary life. Yet in that stillness, the foundations of noir are already in place. The sense that behind every lit window is a private story, that every passerby carries unseen burdens, that the city itself remembers more than it reveals. Soon, filmmakers would begin to explore these ideas with cameras and lights, and actors moving through carefully constructed shadows. They would give faces to the sleepless, voices to the reflective, and shape to the unease that had been quietly gathering for years. For now, though, the city rests. The night deepens. And somewhere, perhaps in a modest office above a closed storefront, a desk lamp burns long after the rest of the building has gone dark, as if someone inside is waiting for a story to begin. And as that lamp continues to glow, steady, patient, unhurried, the stage is set for a new kind of tale, one where certainty fades, motives blur, and the safest place to stand may be just at the edge of the light, where the shadows feel almost like home. Part 2. War, Exile, and Expressionist Shadows. If the world of the 1930s felt uncertain, the years that followed would deepen that uncertainty into something heavier, quieter, and more permanent, like a fog that settles not only over cities, but over memory itself. War does not arrive everywhere at once. At first, it comes as distant newsprint, small headlines on the inside pages of a newspaper folded beside a breakfast plate. Names of unfamiliar cities, borders shifting on maps, speeches crackling over the radio in languages many listeners do not understand. It feels far away, troubling, but abstract, as though happening on another planet. Then, gradually it moves closer. By the early 1940s, the Second World War had drawn the United States fully into its orbit. Factories changed what they produced. Young men left home, wearing new uniforms that still smelled faintly of the warehouse. Train stations filled with embraces that lingered just a moment longer than usual, as if everyone sensed that ordinary time had been interrupted. Cities dimmed their lights for blackout drills. Windows were covered. Street lamps were hooded. At night, familiar neighborhoods became darker than anyone remembered, shapes dissolving into silhouette. People walked carefully, navigating by memory as much as by sight. In that enforced darkness, something shifted in the way the world was perceived. Shadows were no longer merely aesthetic. They were practical, even protective. Light, once associated with safety and progress, became something to control, ration, conceal. For those who would later create film noir, this experience left a deep imprint. When soldiers returned from overseas, they brought back more than medals or photographs. They carried memories difficult to explain in daylight. Long stretches of waiting punctuated by sudden terror, landscapes marked by destruction, the unsettling knowledge that ordinary life could vanish almost overnight. Many resumed civilian routines quietly, without dramatic stories or visible scars. It's something in their gaze, their posture, their silences suggested that the world no longer felt quite as simple as it once had. The war also transformed the home front. Women entered workplaces in unprecedented numbers. Families relocated for industrial jobs. Children grew accustomed to absence. Fathers away at sea or stationed across continents. Letters became lifelines, thin envelopes that carried both reassurance and longing. All of this contributed to a collective mood that was not purely sorrowful, but deeply introspective. People learned to live with uncertainty as a daily companion. They planned for the future while knowing that plans could change without warning. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, another kind of journey was underway. One less visible, but equally consequential. Artists, writers, musicians, and filmmakers fled Europe as authoritarian regimes tightened their grip. Many found refuge in Hollywood, bringing with them not only their talents, but their experiences of upheaval, displacement, and loss. Among these émigrés were directors such as Fritz Lang, Billy Wilder, and Robert Sidemak. They arrived in California, a place of sunshine and palm trees, carrying memories shaped by darker skies. Before leaving Europe, many of them had worked in a cinematic tradition known as German expressionism. This style did not aim to reproduce reality exactly as it appeared. Instead, it sought to visualize inner emotions, anxiety, fear, isolation, through exaggerated sets, stark contrasts, and dramatic lighting. Buildings leaned at improbable angles. Shadows stretched longer than logic would allow. Faces emerged from darkness as if carved from stone. In films such as Metropolis and M, urban environments feel almost alive, towering over individuals who seem small and vulnerable within them. Streets become labyrinths. Staircases spiral like thoughts that cannot find resolution. Light does not simply illuminate, it interrogates. When these filmmakers began working in Hollywood, they adapted their techniques to American stories. The result was subtle but transformative. Sets became more realistic, yet lighting retained a sculptural intensity. Instead of distorted architecture, ordinary rooms were arranged to emphasize depth and confinement. Doorways framing characters like cages, hallways receding into darkness, windows casting bars of shadow across walls. The famous Venetian blind effect, where slats of light cut through darkness in parallel lines, emerged from this approach. It suggested secrecy, surveillance, and emotional distance all at once, without requiring a single word of explanation. Cinematographers, too, embraced these methods. They used low-key lighting, allowing large portions of the frame to fall into shadow. Faces were often half-illuminated, as though revealing only part of a person's inner life. Smoke from cigarettes or street steam softened edges, turning scenes into drifting compositions of gray and black. For audiences accustomed to the brighter, evenly lit films of earlier decades, this visual language felt new and strangely compelling. It mirrored the psychological complexity of the post-war world, a place where certainty had dimmed and motivations were not always transparent. Even daytime scenes in these emerging films often carried a subdued tone. Sunlight might filter through dusty windows rather than blaze openly. Outdoor spaces could feel enclosed by tall buildings, creating pockets of shadow at noon. The city became less a backdrop and more a presence, watchful, indifferent, occasionally menacing, but also oddly comforting in its familiarity. Another influence from wartime experience was the sense of fate. In combat, survival often seemed arbitrary, determined by timing, chance, or decisions made under pressure. This awareness translated into stories where characters were not always masters of their destiny. They made choices, certainly, but those choices unfolded within constraints they did not fully control. A man might accept a job that seemed routine, only to discover hidden complications. A casual encounter might lead to consequences impossible to foresee. The past could resurface at inconvenient moments, refusing to remain buried. Yet even this fatalism was not presented with dramatic thunder. In true noir fashion, it unfolded quietly, almost matter-of-factly, as if characters understood that resistance would change little. Hollywood itself was also changing during these years. Wartime production demands, material shortages, and shifting audience expectations encouraged efficiency. Studios produced many films quickly, often with modest budgets. Limitations, however, can foster creativity. Without elaborate sets or expansive locations, filmmakers relied on lighting, composition, and performance to create atmosphere. Night scenes became especially practical. Darkness concealed simplicity. A single street set could serve multiple stories, transformed by camera angles and lighting variations. Rain machines added texture, making pavement gleam and reflections shimmer. A solitary lamppost could anchor an entire scene, its circle of light defining the boundary between safety and uncertainty. Sound design contributed as well. Footsteps echoed more sharply in empty streets. Distant sirens suggested activity beyond the frame. The hum of traffic softened into a continuous murmur, like the breathing of a vast organism. Dialogue was often delivered in low tones, encouraging audiences to lean in rather than sit back. This quieter style of storytelling suited viewers who had grown accustomed to listening carefully, to radios, to official announcements, to the subtle emotional cues of loved ones coping with separation. After years of upheaval, bombast felt less authentic than understatement. And so, by the mid-1940s, the essential visual and emotional vocabulary of film noir had crystallized. It was not invented in a single moment, but assembled gradually, like pieces of a mosaic forming an image only when viewed from a distance. Imagine a typical night in one of these emerging cinematic cities. Rain falls steadily, not in a violent storm, but in a patient, persistent drizzle. Streetlights halo in the moisture, their glow diffused into soft spheres. A man pauses beneath an awning, collar turned up, not because he is fleeing danger, but because he is thinking, weighing options, replaying conversations, deciding what to do next. Across the street, a window flickers as someone turns off a lamp. Another window brightens as someone else wakes unexpectedly. A taxi passes, its tires hissing on wet pavement, leaving behind a brief wake of reflected light that fades almost immediately. Nothing overtly dramatic occurs, yet the atmosphere suggests that something could happen, that beneath the surface of ordinary life lie hidden tensions and untold stories. This sense of suspended possibility became central to noir. Action was less important than anticipation. The space between events carried as much weight as the events themselves. For the émigré filmmakers who had witnessed the fragility of civilization firsthand, this perspective felt truthful. Life could change suddenly, yes, but most of the time it unfolded in long stretches of waiting, observing, adapting. The drama was internal, expressed through glances, pauses, and choices made in quiet rooms rather than on battlefields. Audiences responded because they recognized this rhythm. They, too, were adjusting to a world that felt simultaneously familiar and altered. The war had ended, but its echoes lingered in architecture, in demographics, in the collective imagination. Film noir did not attempt to resolve these tensions. Instead, it offered a space where they could be acknowledged without explanation. A place where uncertainty was not a problem to solve, but a condition to inhabit. And so, as the decade progressed, Hollywood found itself producing stories that felt darker, more introspective, and strangely soothing in their honesty. They did not promise that everything would be all right. They suggested, instead, that one could continue moving forward even when clarity was elusive. If part one of our journey unfolded in the dim, pre-war glow of radios and apartment lamps, part two exists in a deeper chiaroscuro, light and shadow interwoven so tightly that neither can be separated from the other. The world had grown more complex. People had grown more watchful. Cities had grown quieter in ways that daylight could not fully erase. Yet there was also resilience in this mood, a recognition that beauty could exist in subdued tones, that calm could be found not in certainty, but in acceptance, that even the longest night eventually gives way to morning, though perhaps not as quickly as one might wish. Somewhere in that rain-softened city, a door closes gently. Footsteps recede down a corridor. A desk lamp clicks off, leaving behind a faint afterimage on the retina. Outside, the street remains, patient and enduring, holding the reflections of lights that will burn until dawn. And in that lingering darkness, the visual poetry of film noir has found its true form, not as spectacle, but as atmosphere shaped by war, exile, and the quiet human effort to make sense of a world where shadows have become permanent companions. Part 3. The birth of film noir in 1940s Hollywood. By the early 1940s, all the elements we have been quietly gathering, the weary tone of hard-boiled fiction, the visual language of European expressionism, the psychological weight of war, and the anonymity of modern cities, began to converge in one particular place. Hollywood. Not the Hollywood of bright premieres and flashbulbs, though that still existed, but the working Hollywood of sound stages, backlit streets, and long days that stretched into artificial nights under banks of studio lamps. It was here, in carefully constructed darkness, that film noir first took recognizable shape. At the time, no one used the term film noir. These were simply crime pictures, melodramas, or thrillers, often produced efficiently, sometimes even considered secondary projects compared to lavish musicals or historical epics. Yet in hindsight, they feel like something entirely new, quieter, more intimate, less interested in spectacle than in mood. One of the earliest and most influential of these films was the Maltese Falcon. From its opening moments, the film establishes a tone that is both calm and faintly uneasy, as though the air itself carries secrets. Offices are dim even during the day. Conversations unfold behind closed doors. Characters speak carefully, measuring what to reveal and what to withhold. At the center is Humphrey Bogart as private detective Sam Spade, not a glamorous hero, not a crusader for justice, but a professional. He listens more than he speaks. He watches. He waits. His stillness becomes a kind of gravity around which the story revolves. Bogart's performance would come to define the noir protagonist. Intelligent but tired, principled but not naive, capable of kindness yet wary of attachment. He moves through the film like someone who has learned that certainty is rare and trust must be earned slowly, if at all. The film's visual style reinforces this emotional restraint. Rooms feel enclosed, even when spacious. Lamps cast localized pools of light, leaving corners in shadow. Windows admit daylight that seems filtered, as though the outside world has been muted before entering. The effect is not oppressive so much as introspective, a world turned slightly inward. Audiences responded to this tone. After years of upheaval, stories that acknowledge complexity without raising their voices felt strangely comforting. These films did not demand excitement. They invited attention. A few years later came another landmark, Double Indemnity, directed by émigré filmmaker Billy Wilder. If the Maltese Falcon established the detective figure in noir's center, Double Indemnity shifted focus to an ordinary man whose life drifts quietly off course. Fred McMurray's insurance salesman is not a criminal mastermind or a hardened cynic. He is polite, competent, and somewhat lonely, the kind of man who blends easily into office corridors and commuter trains. When he meets the enigmatic Phyllis Dietrichson, played by Barbara Stanwyck, the encounter unfolds not as a dramatic collision, but as a slow gravitational pull. Stanwyck's performance introduced one of noir's most enduring figures, the femme fatale. Yet in this early form, She is less a caricature of danger than a study in ambiguity. Her voice is calm, her manner controlled, her intentions never fully stated. She does not shout or threaten. She simply suggests possibilities, leaving others to take the decisive steps. The film's famous use of voiceover narration adds another layer of intimacy. As the protagonist recounts his story, the audience becomes a silent confidant, listening to a confession delivered not in panic, but in weary acceptance. It feels less like testimony and more like reflection, the quiet sorting of memories late at night when sleep will not come. Visually, the film embraces deep shadows and stark contrasts, yet these elements serve mood rather than spectacle. Venetian blind patterns fall across faces like gentle barriers. Staircases descend into darkness not as traps, but as unknowns. Even moments of tension unfold with deliberate pacing, allowing silence to carry as much meaning as dialogue. Around the same time, another film explored noir from a different angle, Laura. Unlike the overt criminality of other noir stories, Laura begins with absence, a woman apparently dead, known only through memories, portraits, and the impression she left behind. Starring Jean Tierney, the film drifts between investigation and reverie. Detectives examine rooms that feel preserved in time, as though waiting for their occupant to return. Objects become clues not only to events, but to personality. A perfume bottle, a painting, a letter tucked into a drawer. The atmosphere is hushed, almost dreamlike. Music swells and recedes like distant waves. Dialogue often pauses mid-thought, characters distracted by their own recollections. The mystery itself becomes secondary to the mood of longing and uncertainty. Together, these films established key characteristics that would define noir throughout the decade. First, the protagonists were rarely larger than life. They were professionals, employees, veterans, clerks, individuals navigating systems rather than dominating them. Their struggles felt plausible, their decisions shaped by circumstance as much as by desire. Second, moral clarity was replaced by ambiguity. Characters could be sympathetic yet flawed, honorable yet compromised. Good intentions did not guarantee good outcomes. Choices carried consequences that unfolded slowly, sometimes invisibly, like cracks spreading beneath a polished surface. Third, the urban environment became central. Cities in noir are neither purely hostile nor welcoming. They are vast, indifferent landscapes, offering anonymity and opportunity in equal measure. Streets at night feel less dangerous than lonely, less chaotic than suspended, as if the city itself is pausing between breaths. And finally, narration, whether spoken directly to the audience or implied through visual storytelling, created a sense of intimacy. These films feel as though they are confiding in you personally, sharing stories meant for late hours when distractions fade and attention sharpens. Production circumstances also contributed to this distinctive style. Many noir films were made on modest budgets, categorized as B pictures, without the resources for elaborate sets or large casts. Directors focused on atmosphere. A single room could serve as the primary location. A handful of actors could carry the narrative. Lighting did the work of decoration, shaping space through contrast rather than construction. Night shooting on backlit streets became common. These artificial urban environments, though physically limited, could be transformed endlessly through camera placement and lighting design. One night, it might be a respectable business district. The next, a deserted neighborhood. The next, a place of quiet rendezvous beneath a flickering street lamp. Rain again proved useful. It added texture, movement, and reflective surfaces that multiplied light sources into shimmering patterns. Pavement became a canvas of abstract shapes, footsteps producing soft splashes that punctuated silence. Sound design remained restrained. Music underscored emotion without overwhelming it. Dialogue favored measured delivery over theatrical projection. Even gunshots, when they occurred, often sounded muted, absorbed by the surrounding darkness. Perhaps most importantly, these films trusted stillness. A character sitting alone in a room, thinking, could hold the screen as effectively as any chase or confrontation. The camera lingered on faces, on hands, on small gestures. A cigarette tapped against an ashtray, a glass rotated slowly on a tabletop, a glance toward a door that may or may not open. For audiences accustomed to the noise of wartime newsreels and the bustle of daily life, this stillness offered a kind of refuge. It allowed space to breathe, to observe, to process. By the mid to late 1940s, the style had matured. Viewers began to recognize its patterns even if they did not name them. A certain type of poster promised a certain type of experience. A story unfolding primarily at night, centered on flawed individuals, shaped by atmosphere rather than action. Critics would later look back and identify this period as the birth of film noir, but at the time it felt less like a revolution and more like a quiet shift in tone, a dimming of lights, a lowering of voices, a turning inward. Imagine leaving a theater after one of these films. It is late. The crowd disperses without much chatter. Streetlights glow steadily. A few storefronts remain open, their interiors warm and inviting, but the sidewalks are mostly empty. You walk home, not in excitement, but in contemplation. The story lingers, not because of its plot twists, but because of its mood. You find yourself noticing details, the echo of your footsteps, the pattern of light on brick walls, the way your shadow stretches ahead of you under each lamp and then disappears again. By the time you reach your door, the world feels slightly altered, as though you have glimpsed a hidden layer beneath everyday reality. That subtle transformation is the essence of early film noir. It does not overwhelm, it seeps in. It suggests that beneath ordinary routines lie untold stories, that every passerby carries invisible history, that the night itself holds a kind of quiet truth unavailable in daylight. And so, in sound stages across Hollywood, technicians adjusted lights, actors rehearsed subdued dialogue, directors composed frames filled with shadow and reflection, all contributing to a body of work that would, over time, become one of cinema's most enduring and influential traditions. The shadows were no longer accidental. They were deliberate, expressive, meaningful. Not simply darkness, but a language that spoke softly, patiently, waiting for anyone willing to listen. And as the decade continued, that language would deepen, expanding beyond detectives and insurance salesmen into a wider landscape of temptation, longing, and fate. Stories set beneath neon signs and rain clouds, where danger did not always announce itself, and where the most decisive moments often occurred in silence. But for now, in this formative period, film noir has taken its first full breath, a calm, measured inhalation before the longer night to come. Part 4. Rain-soaked streets and fatal temptations. If the early years of film noir introduced us to its tone, quiet, reflective, morally uncertain, the later 1940s deepened that atmosphere into something richer and more hypnotic. The shadows grew longer. The nights grew wetter. The emotional stakes, though still expressed softly, carried a sense of inevitability, like footsteps approaching from the far end of an empty corridor. This is the era most people imagine when they hear the word noir. A city after midnight, rain falling in a steady silver curtain, neon signs humming above half-empty streets, and somewhere, just out of view, a story beginning that will not end quite the way anyone hopes. In these films, the city itself becomes more than a setting. It becomes a companion, sometimes indifferent, sometimes watchful, always present. Streets glisten as though freshly polished by the rain. Reflections stretch and ripple with each passing car, doubling the world in wavering light. Fire escapes zigzag down brick walls like silent ladders to nowhere. Elevated trains thunder overhead, briefly shaking loose dust that settles again as quietly as snow. Yet despite these details, the dominant mood is not chaos but solitude. A lone figure walking beneath a street lamp appears less threatened than suspended, caught between pools of light and shadow, visible for a moment and then gone again. Footsteps echo not because someone is chasing them, but because there is no one else around to absorb the sound. Cinematographers perfected techniques that made these nocturnal landscapes feel tangible. Water on pavement acted as a mirror, amplifying even modest lighting into luminous patterns. Fog softened distant shapes, turning buildings into silhouettes layered one behind another like stage flats. Practical light sources, lamps, headlights, glowing signs, replaced broad illumination, creating a world defined by pockets of visibility surrounded by mystery. One of the most evocative recurring images is the window with Venetian blinds. From outside, it suggests privacy and secrecy. From inside, it casts striped shadows across faces and walls, as though the room itself is divided into fragments. Characters stand within these stripes like figures behind invisible bars, separated not by physical constraints, but by circumstance, by choices already made. Inside apartments, hotel rooms, and offices, space feels intimate and slightly claustrophobic. Furniture is functional rather than decorative. A chair pulled too close to a desk. A bed that doubles as a sofa. A small table bearing the quiet evidence of a solitary life. An ashtray. A half-finished drink. A book left open face down. These interiors often seem less like homes than temporary shelters, places where characters pause rather than belong. Music, too, evolved during this period, weaving jazz influences into film scores. Not the exuberant swing of crowded dance halls, but slower, more introspective melodies. Muted trumpets, brushed drums, piano lines that wander rather than resolve. The sound feels like conversation overheard through a wall, intimate, slightly melancholy, and strangely soothing. Nightclubs became important locations in many noir stories. Yet even these spaces carry a subdued tone. Performers sing to attentive but restrained audiences. Tables are small islands of light in a dim sea. Conversations occur in low voices, punctuated by the clink of glassware and the soft rustle of fabric. It is a social environment that preserves loneliness rather than dispelling it. And within these spaces, one figure often exerts a gravitational pull on the narrative, the femme fatale. By the mid to late 1940s, this character had become both iconic and elusive, less a single archetype than a constellation of traits. She might be glamorous or understated, confident or apparently vulnerable. What unites these portrayals is not overt malice, but opacity. She does not reveal everything she knows. Her motivations remain partially obscured, like a face glimpsed through smoke. A quintessential example appears in Gilda, starring Rita Hayworth. When Hayworth's character first appears, the moment is not explosive but mesmerizing. She tilts her head, offers a faint smile, and the room seems to rearrange itself around her presence. Light catches her hair, shadows frame her face. Nothing dramatic happens, yet everything feels altered. The power of such characters lies in suggestion rather than action. They rarely force events directly. Instead, they create conditions in which others make consequential choices. Choices driven by desire, resentment, curiosity, or simply the wish to escape an ordinary life. In many noir narratives, the male protagonist is not destroyed by an external enemy, but by his own decisions, influenced by emotion rather than logic. He steps across an invisible line, often quietly, without ceremony. A favor granted, a lie told, a meeting agreed to that should perhaps have been declined. Once that line is crossed, events unfold with a slow, almost dreamlike inevitability. Not because fate is supernatural, but because human choices accumulate, each narrowing the range of possible outcomes. This sense of entrapment is rarely depicted as frantic struggle. Instead, characters move forward with a kind of weary awareness, as though they understand the trajectory but cannot quite alter it. Conversations take on double meanings. Casual remarks linger uneasily in memory. Silence fills the spaces between words, carrying its own weight. Rain amplifies this mood. In noir, rain is less a storm than a steady presence, a veil separating characters from the rest of the world. It muffles sound, blurs outlines, and provides a plausible reason for people to remain indoors together longer than intended. Windows bead with water, distorting the view outside into shifting abstract shapes. Under streetlights, falling rain becomes visible as countless thin lines, like threads stitching sky to earth. Cars pass, sending fans of spray across sidewalks. Footprints appear briefly in wet surfaces and then vanish. There is something inherently calming about this imagery, a rhythmic continuity that suggests time passing without urgency. For viewers, it creates a meditative backdrop against which emotional drama unfolds quietly. Another recurring motif is the staircase. Whether in apartment buildings, office towers, or shadowed back entrances, stairs symbolize transition. Characters ascend toward uncertain destinations or descend into spaces that feel progressively more enclosed. The camera often lingers at landings, emphasizing pauses between movements, moments when someone might turn back, though they rarely do. Elevators serve a similar function. Doors slide open with mechanical precision, revealing interiors lit like small stage sets. For a brief interval, characters are suspended between floors, neither here nor there, confined in a box moving through darkness. These architectural elements reinforce the theme of in-between states, between innocence and experience, freedom and confinement, hope and resignation. Even daylight scenes in this mature noir period carry echoes of night. Sunlight appears filtered through urban haze or obstructed by tall buildings. Parts feel deserted rather than lively. The brightness of day seems almost intrusive, exposing realities that characters would prefer to keep softened by shadow. Yet Noir never portrays darkness as wholly negative. On the contrary, night often provides a form of protection, anonymity, privacy, a suspension of ordinary expectations. Conversations that would feel awkward in daylight become possible after midnight. Confessions emerge more easily when faces are half hidden. There is a paradox at the heart of noir. Danger and comfort coexist. The same shadow that conceals threat also offers refuge. The same rain that isolates also soothes. For audiences in the late 1940s, this paradox resonated deeply. The war had ended, but its emotional aftereffects lingered. People were rebuilding lives, pursuing prosperity, yet still adjusting to memories that did not fade on schedule. Noir provided a symbolic landscape where complexity was acknowledged without needing resolution. Watching these films could feel like walking alone through a quiet city, not frightening, not exhilarating, but contemplative, a chance to inhabit a mood rather than solve a problem. Imagine a typical closing sequence from this era. The main conflict has reached its outcome, often subdued rather than triumphant. The camera returns to the city at night. Rain continues to fall as it did before the story began. Traffic moves steadily. A neon sign flickers, goes dark, then glows again. Life proceeds. Perhaps a window light turns off, suggesting someone has finally gone to bed. Perhaps a newspaper vendor stacks unsold copies, preparing to close. Perhaps dawn is hinted at only by a slight lightening of the sky, not yet enough to dispel the shadows. The implication is that the city contains countless other stories unfolding simultaneously, most of them unseen. The film has illuminated one small corner of that vast mosaic and then withdrawn, leaving the rest intact. This understated approach is what gives classic noir its enduring power. It does not claim to reveal ultimate truths. It offers glimpses, fragments of experience framed by atmosphere. And in those rain-soaked streets, beneath the glow of neon and the hush of falling water, temptation rarely announces itself as evil. It appears as opportunity, companionship, relief from loneliness, a chance to rewrite one's story. Whether that chance leads to redemption or regret is almost secondary. What matters is the moment of decision, the quiet turning point when someone steps forward instead of away, speaks instead of remaining silent, stays instead of leaving. In noir, that moment is rarely dramatic. It happens in a glance, a pause, a soft, all right, spoken into the dim light of a room where the future cannot quite be seen. Outside, the rain keeps falling. The city keeps breathing. And somewhere, Another story is already beginning, carried on the same soft rhythm of footsteps on wet pavement, of headlights passing like slow comets, of shadows stretching and dissolving with each change of light. A world of fatal temptations, perhaps, but also a world of quiet human longing, rendered in tones gentle enough to linger long after the screen fades to black. Part 5. The Fade of the Classic Era. By the early 1950s, something subtle began to change. Not all at once. Not with a dramatic announcement or a final curtain. Rather, like the slow paling of a night sky before dawn, the atmosphere that had defined classic film noir began to soften, to shift, to move in new directions. The war was over. Soldiers had returned. Factories that once produced aircraft and munitions turned back to refrigerators and automobiles. Across America, new neighborhoods appeared almost overnight. Rows of tidy houses with small lawns and fresh paint, built along curving suburban streets far removed from the dense verticality of downtown life. Highways expanded. Commutes lengthened. The horizon itself seemed to widen. Prosperity, or at least the promise of it, became a defining feature of the decade. Advertisements glowed with optimism. Department stores filled their windows with bright fabrics and polished appliances. Television sets entered living rooms, bringing entertainment directly into the home. And in this new brightness, the shadowed urban world of classic noir began to feel like a relic of a previous mood. But moods do not vanish, they evolve. In the early 1950s, noir did not disappear so much as deepen. The streets were still there. The rain still fell. Yet the focus shifted inward, from external temptations towards psychological complexity. Characters were no longer simply entangled in crime or passion. They were wrestling with identity, memory, and the uneasy awareness that success did not always bring satisfaction. One of the most reflective films bridging this transition is Sunset Boulevard. Directed by Billy Wilder, it turns the noir lens not on anonymous city streets, but on Hollywood itself. The story unfolds in a grand, yet decaying mansion, where faded glamour lingers like perfume long after its wearer has left the room. The house feels frozen in time, heavy drapes blocking sunlight, chandeliers casting muted glows, furniture preserved as though awaiting applause that will never come. Outside, the modern city hums with new ambition. Inside, the past refuses to release its grip. Narrated with the calm resignation typical of noir, the film contemplates ambition and illusion, examining how dreams can outlive their practicality. Its darkness is not merely visual, but emotional, a meditation on obsolescence in a culture racing toward novelty. Around the same time, filmmakers experimented with pushing noir's visual language to its limits. One of the most striking examples is Touch of Evil, directed by and starring Orson Welles. By the late 1950s, noir's aesthetic had grown more baroque, more stylized. Camera angles tilted more boldly. Shadows stretched more dramatically. Moral ambiguity felt heavier, less romantic. In Touch of Evil, border towns replace metropolitan centers, suggesting that corruption is not confined to any single geography. Authority figures themselves become suspect, blurring distinctions between law and lawlessness. The mood is thicker, almost feverish, as though the genre senses its own approaching transformation. Yet while certain films intensified noir's style, broader cultural forces were nudging it toward twilight. Television altered viewing habits. Instead of venturing into darkened theaters for late-night screenings, families gathered around small, glowing screens at home. The intimacy that noir once offered in cinemas was now replicated and domesticated by broadcast programs in living rooms. Color film, too, became increasingly dominant. The stark black and white contrast that had defined classic noir gave way to richer palettes. While color could still convey mood, it changed the texture of storytelling. Shadows felt less absolute when rendered in blues and browns rather than pure black. Urban America itself was transforming. Suburban expansion drew populations outward. Shopping centers replaced corner stores. The anonymity of the crowded city block gave way to the familiarity and scrutiny of quieter neighborhoods. In these new environments, the archetypal trench-coated detective seemed slightly out of place. And yet, the emotional core of noir did not vanish. It migrated. Films of the mid to late 1950s often retained noir's themes, but reframed them within different settings. Psychological thrillers explored paranoia and distrust beneath suburban calm. Westerns absorbed noir's moral ambiguity, presenting landscapes vast and sunlit, yet ethically complex. Even science fiction borrowed its sense of isolation and uncertainty. The fade of classic noir, then, was less a disappearance than a diffusion. The genre's vocabulary, shadow, doubt, fatalism, introspection, seeped into other forms, influencing them quietly. For audiences who had grown up during the Depression and war years, this shift felt natural. They were aging into different phases of life. Responsibilities multiplied. The urgency of youthful risk gave way to the subtler anxieties of stability. Mortgages, careers, family expectations. Noir's earlier focus on temptation and sudden downfall began to resonate less than stories about compromise and disillusionment. Characters were no longer merely caught in dangerous situations. They were confronting the slow realization that certain dreams had altered shape. The city at night still existed, but it no longer felt like the sole stage for human drama. Instead, unease seeped into daylight spaces, suburban kitchens, corporate offices, sunlit highways stretching toward uncertain destinations. Imagine a late 1950s evening. The rain has stopped. The streets are drier now, though faint reflections remain where puddles have not fully evaporated. Neon signs flicker less frequently. Fluorescent lights hum steadily in modern storefronts. Cars glide past with smoother engines, their chrome catching stray glints of light. In a modest living room, a television glows. A family sits quietly, watching a program whose crisp brightness contrasts with the smoky theaters of a decade earlier. The world feels safer, perhaps more structured. Yet beneath the surface, questions linger about authenticity, about progress, about what has been gained and what has been left behind. Classic noir belonged to a particular historical convergence. The economic hardship of the 1930s, the upheaval of the 1940s, the artistic migration from Europe, the visual possibilities of black and white cinematography. As those conditions shifted, so too did the form. By the close of the 1950s, the cycle commonly identified as classic film noir had largely concluded. The phrase itself would be coined later by French critics who, looking back, recognized a pattern in these shadowed American films. But for contemporary viewers, there was no formal farewell, no banner announcing the end. The style simply thinned out, appearing less frequently, replaced by other genres attuned to a new era. And yet, something remained. The visual memory of slatted shadows across a wall. The sound of measured footsteps on wet pavement. The image of a solitary figure beneath a street lamp, pausing before making a choice. These motifs did not vanish. They settled into the collective imagination, waiting. In retrospect, the fate of classic noir feels almost poetic, appropriate for a genre so attuned to impermanence. Like a cigarette burning down to its final ember, its glow softened, flickered, and eventually went dark. But the faint trail of smoke lingered in the air long after. If one were to walk through a city in the late 1950s, attentive and unhurried, traces of noir would still be visible. A narrow alley between newly painted buildings. A detective novel displayed in a drugstore rack. A late-night radio host speaking in a low, confidential tone. The mood had not disappeared. It had become less centralized, less dominant, but still accessible to those who knew where to look. And perhaps that is the true legacy of the classic era. Not that it ended, but that it seeded future storytelling with a sensibility attuned to shadow and complexity. As the decade closed, Hollywood prepared to enter a new period of experimentation. Younger filmmakers would soon challenge conventions. Social movements would reshape narratives. Technology would alter how stories were filmed and consumed. But before that transformation took hold, there was this gentle twilight, a moment when the lights of classic noir dimmed gradually rather than abruptly. Imagine once more a city at night. The rain has ceased. The air feels cleaner, cooler. Streetlights remain steady. In one upper floor window, a lamp clicks off. In another, it burns a little longer, illuminating a solitary figure reading, thinking, remembering. The shadows are softer now, but they have not vanished. They wait, patient as ever, for another era to rediscover them. Part 6, Neo-Noir and the Shadows That Never Left Us. When the classic era of film noir faded in the late 1950s, the shadows did not disappear. They simply moved. They slipped into other genres, into television dramas, into crime novels stacked on bedside tables. They lingered in the way certain stories were told, in the hesitation before confession, in the quiet doubt beneath confident dialogue, in the understanding that the world was more complicated than it first appeared. And then, in the 1970s, something interesting happened. A new generation of filmmakers, many of them raised on the movies of the 1940s and 50s, began to look backward with curiosity. They were living in a different America now. The optimism of the post-war boom had been shaken by political scandal, social upheaval, and a lingering sense of distrust toward institutions once assumed to be stable. Cities once again felt uncertain. Headlines carried a different kind of tension. The brightness of mid-century promise had dimmed slightly at the edges. And so, almost naturally, the language of noir returned, not as imitation, but as reinterpretation. One of the most elegant examples is Chinatown. Set in 1930s Los Angeles, but filmed through the lens of 1970s sensibility, it feels like both homage and evolution. The private detective is back. The city is once again a maze of secrets. The atmosphere carries that familiar quiet dread, the sense that truth exists, but at a cost. Yet the tone is different from the original noir era. The moral ambiguity is heavier, the resolution less reassuring. The shadows feel less like stylistic flourishes and more like metaphors for systemic corruption, for the realization that not all mysteries can be resolved cleanly. Where classic more often focused on individual choices leading to personal downfall, neo-noir widened the frame. It suggested that corruption could be structural, embedded in the very foundations of society. The rain-soaked streets remained, but now they reflected a more complex world. Around the same time, another film reimagined noir in a radically different setting, Blade Runner. Here, the trench-coated detective wanders not through mid-century alleyways, but through a futuristic city bathed in neon and perpetual rain. Despite its science fiction setting, the emotional core is unmistakably noir. The protagonist is weary, introspective, uncertain of his own moral footing. The city towers overhead in oppressive layers of light and shadow. Smoke drifts through beams of illumination. Questions of identity and memory replace the missing person cases of earlier decades. The film suggests something profound. Noir is not tied to a specific time period. It is a mood, a lens, a way of viewing the world when certainty feels fragile. By the 1990s, this sensibility had become fully integrated into contemporary storytelling. LA Confidential revisited the post-war Los Angeles of classic noir with both affection and critique. Its polished surfaces, glamorous parties, tidy neighborhoods, conceal corruption and ambition beneath. The film honors the visual language of the 1940s, the tailored suits, the glowing streetlights, the intimate interiors, while allowing modern audiences to examine the myths those earlier films sometimes softened. It recognizes nostalgia without surrendering to it. What unites these neo-noir works is not simply aesthetic homage, but thematic continuity. The shadows remain because the human condition remains. Temptation still exists, not always in the form of a mysterious stranger, but as opportunity, ambition, the desire to be seen or understood. Isolation persists, even in crowded digital cities. Institutions inspire both trust and skepticism. Individuals navigate systems larger than themselves, making choices that ripple outward in unforeseen ways. And visually, the tools have evolved while the spirit endures. Color cinematography has replaced black and white, yet directors often mute palettes into cool blues, deep ambers, and inky blacks. Rain is still a favored companion, its rhythmic fall offering texture and reflection. Neon signs glow brighter than ever, but they flicker with the same ambiguous allure. The voiceover narration, once a hallmark of classic noir, appears more sparingly now. Yet when it does, it carries the same intimate quality. A voice speaking not to a crowd, but to you, as if you're the only one awake. Technology has changed how stories are consumed. Films stream into quiet bedrooms. Episodes unfold on tablets and phones. Yet the appeal of noir remains especially suited to late hours. It is storytelling for insomniacs and thinkers, for those who find clarity not in midday brightness but in midnight stillness. Consider how often contemporary crime dramas adopt noir's pacing. Slow, deliberate, attentive to atmosphere. Long shots of empty streets. Music that hums rather than shouts. Characters who hesitate before answering a question, aware that words, once spoken, cannot be retrieved. Even beyond crime narratives, noir's influence can be felt. Psychological thrillers explore fractured identity. Superhero films adopt morally conflicted protagonists. Political dramas frame institutions as labyrinths rather than fortresses. The shadows, in other words, never left. They adapted. Perhaps this endurance speaks to something fundamental. Light alone can feel harsh, exposing every flaw. Darkness alone can feel disorienting. But the interplay between the two, the delicate balance of illumination and concealment, reflects the way most of us experience life. We know certain things clearly. Others remain partially obscured. We move forward with incomplete information, guided by instinct, memory, and hope. We make choices in moments that feel quiet at the time, but significant in retrospect. Noir understands this rhythm. It does not promise perfect justice or total clarity. It acknowledges that outcomes are sometimes messy, that motives are layered, that people contain contradictions. Yet it also affirms persistence, the quiet decision to keep going, to keep investigating, to keep searching for meaning even when answers prove elusive. And so, as we reach the present day, the legacy of noir feels less like a historical artifact and more like a living current beneath modern storytelling. Imagine a contemporary city at night. Skyscrapers glow with thousands of windows. Traffic flows steadily along rain-slick avenues. Somewhere, a late-shift worker locks an office door and steps into the cool air. Somewhere else, a detective, perhaps literal, perhaps metaphorical, reviews notes beneath a desk lamp, piecing together fragments of a larger puzzle. Music drifts from an apartment window. A siren wails faintly in the distance, then fades. Neon signage reflects in puddles, colors blending into abstract patterns that ripple with each passing car. The technology is new. The skyline is altered. But the mood, that contemplative hush between action and consequence, feels timeless. Film noir began as an unintentional convergence of historical forces. Economic hardship, global conflict, artistic migration, and technological limitation. It flourished in black and white streets, shaped by shadow and restraint. It faded as prosperity and color reshaped the cultural landscape. Its essence proved resilient, because noir is not merely about crime, or detectives, or fatal attraction. It is about how we navigate uncertainty. It is about the stories we tell ourselves in quiet rooms after midnight. About the choices made when no one else is watching. About the understanding that light reveals and conceals in equal measure. And perhaps that is why noir remains especially suited to the late hours, to the space between waking and sleep. As you imagine one last scene, let it be simple. Rain falls softly on a darkened street. A single lamp burns in an upstairs window. Somewhere below, footsteps echo briefly, then disappear. The city breathes, steady, unhurried. The shadows do not threaten. They rest. They have been with us for nearly a century now, stretching from black and white soundstages to neon futures, from trench-coated detectives to modern antiheroes. They remind us that complexity is not something to fear, but something to acknowledge. Even now, somewhere in the world, a story is unfolding beneath a streetlight. A choice is being considered, a memory revisited, a truth slowly uncovered. And as long as there are nights and cities, and human hearts uncertain of their own depths, the shadows will remain.